Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the United States government. We also will be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we will have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it into the group chat and I'll go through them in the order received. So, often attributed to General Omar Bradley, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. As we look at the fight in the first and second island chains, the tyranny of distance complicates the issue of getting the beads, bullets, and band-aids to the right people at the right time. But this isn't the first time that we've had to fight in this region. In fact, next Monday marks 81 years since the initial landings of 1st Marine Division going ashore at Guadalcanal. So we've solved this problem in the past, but how have we done that? So recently, the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command, located just up the road in Washington, D.C., published the Contested Logistics Sustaining the Pacific War, and it sets the stage by discussing Navy logistics from the earliest days of the Navy up to the First World War, into the interwar periods, and then diving into the meat of the topic. So with us to discuss are two of the authors of the book, Dr. Peter Lupke. He earned his PhD from the University of Virginia, where he studied United States military history. Before joining Naval History and Heritage Command, he worked in the historic preservation at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and authored or co-authored several National Register of Historic Places nominations, including that of the USS Wisconsin. Currently a historian at NHHC, he has served on the Director's Action Group and as Deputy Histories Branch Head. His NHHC publications include the autobiography of Rear Admiral John A. Dahlgren and Richard Kelly Turner, Planning the Pacific War. And we also have Dr. Timothy Francis. Dr. Francis earned his PhD from the University of Maryland, where he completed an economic analysis of the Battle of the Atlantic under Dr. John Sumida. Currently senior advisory historian at NHHC, he has served as Histories Branch Head and now leads the Histories Advisory Group. His NHHC publications include dozens of contributions to the Command Online Reading Room, numerous ship histories, and two recent publications, Richmond Kelly Turner, Planning the Pacific War, and Contested Logistics. He's also currently a Senior Chief Intelligence Specialist in the Navy Reserve with past duty experiences at ONI, AFRICOM, EUCOM, and 2 mobilization deployments to Iraq. So with that said, gentlemen, would you like to kick it off and discuss the book?
All right. So I'm Tim Francis, Dr. Francis, and Peter Lupke next to me. We the book itself was generated by a demand signal from Pac Fleet N40, and that was about a year ago, roughly. And we probably spent September through January writing it, about 4 months. We were able to access material in mainly our archive. Basically, the Richmond Kelly Turner papers was the main source, but we had a lot of other records that our archive still holds that have not yet been transferred to the National Archives or we're keeping. So that's one way to say that it was a relatively quick research and writing process. So we weren't able to look at everything. Right? So this was sort of a narrow look at the question of the N40 asked, the supply people asked was, we have this institutional memory that we did these great things in World War II, but what did we actually do? Right? That was the question that they asked us. So we kind of went through, and that's why this is a sort of shorter survey booklet and not a giant tome, because we'd still be working on that if we were trying to do some massive booklet. So I think it's 88 pages total. But it essentially was also they wouldn't read 800 page book. So we made it shorter. I think after we got the tasking, we then had to think about how we're going to structure it and do the approach. So I'll let Peter start talking that angle.
So earlier, Major, you mentioned the problem of logistics. And the way that I've thought about this project from the start is, how did the Navy come to realize that logistics was a problem that it would have to confront? And those are what the earlier chapters of the book really covers, is how did the Navy conceive of supply? Did it conceive of something more broadly than supply, what today we would call logistics, and how did it go about addressing that? And really, there was a lot of essentially short-term, ad hoc, nothing programmatic or systematic from most of the Navy's history up until the Second World War. And so that was very difficult to really conceptualize and get our arms around those early years, because the Navy itself wasn't thinking about logistics in terms of logistics. And so the Navy structures and organizations were not set up in the way that they are today, or even were during World War II. And so those are the earlier chapters of the book, is the Navy's dawning consciousness as it moved from the age of sail to coal to oil, that it would have to think more rigorously about supply, also how this ties into planning overall and generally speaking. And so then that kind of gets us up until World War II. And then the World War II chapters, really we wanted to give a thumbnail sketch of basically how the Navy was really winging it. Is that the interwar period, there had been discussion and thought, training about how would the Navy meet these logistical burdens of World War II. But as an institution, the structures within the Navy that would really permit smooth functioning had not been established yet. And those were an outgrowth of World War II. And then another component that we've been asked to cover, really something that's very always of perennial interest, the final chapter, which is really about institutional learning. So the Navy gets to the end of World War II, it's come through the other side. And so then how does it go about assessing what lessons it learned? Like, how does it really comprehend the logistical effort during World War II, rate that, and then how does it institutionalize and perpetuate that knowledge? And so that's the final chapter of that. And so if you have any additions to that thumbnail sketch, Tim.
Yeah, I did want to talk about chapters 3 and 4. So those are the two chapters that deal with Guadalcanal, which we kind of see as this pivot point where the Navy goes into the Pacific War partially prepared, but certainly not completely prepared. And there's this 5-6 month period where Admiral Turner, who's in charge, he's leading South Pacific Amphibious Force. He's responsible for not only the various landing operations, but also sustainment afterwards, right? So there's a whole question of how do they figure out how to do this? And for example, when Turner shows up in the South Pacific, he shows up after Gormley in July, early to mid-July. And he's basically told, you have about 3 weeks to plan Operation Watchtower. And because of that, there's no real thought to the sustainment problem, right? It's how do we get them there, right? How do we get First Marines on the ground, safely landed, protect the task force, everything. And then we'll worry about sustainment afterwards. And that's sort of forced by circumstances, because Gormley and MacArthur actually in late June had actually asked to postpone the operation. because there were the air bases at Espiritu Santos and the New Hebrides weren't fully developed. Right? So they were worried about air support for the landings. And so both Gormley and McCarthy had asked JCS to postpone it, but the JCS said no. You need to go ahead and do it, take advantage of the moment, because it's right after Midway. So so they go out there, and Turner's doing his planning. He has 6 staff officers to do the whole operation. 5 of them have no logistics experience. But he has 4 Marine officers, all of which who have some experience with landings and amphibious logistics. So he actually praises the Marines for helping him out on that side of the house. But there's a whole series of events that take place over the next 4 months where they're learning how to do these operations under the pressure of wartime operations. Right? When you have an opponent who's actually doing something actively, and it's not a war game, you can't plan it. Right? So the Japanese are actively doing things to disrupt your operations. And Turner and the staff are figuring out the logistics side of responding to that as they go along. For example, there's a quote in chapter 2, a couple of quotes, where one is from Duncan Ballantyne, who wrote Beans, Bullets, and Black Oil, where he says, no constructive exercise in peace can quite duplicate the urgency and stringency of logistic conditions in war, because during practice, the requirements for logistics support are specific and calculable and are thus assumed in real life. And then same with Norman Friedman's book on planning the Pacific War. He says, war games assume that the overall logistics situation would support operations rather than consider planning and logistics as precursors to operations. And this kind of all feeds into one of the demand signals from Pac Fleet N40 was they kept foot stomping the concept of logistics as line work, that line officers should know how to do logistics and it should be incorporated into planning and operations. And that was one of the approaches we took on this is sort of Turner figuring that out as the Guadalcanal campaign goes on. The only other point I wanted to make was, we can get to some others during questions, but the other point I wanted to make was there's an interesting example of Turner's feelings about reserve officers, which was not good. And so, because one of the problems was that, I mean, the Navy's pretty small in the 1930s, and there's a vast expansion, and they had a lot of people come into the Navy kind of as brand new, like DCOs, and they all joined the Navy Reserve, even though they basically had come off the street. That's why you get the claim that 80% of people who were in World War II were in the reserves. That's because that's what happened with all the draftees and all the volunteers. They put them in the reserves, not the active duty. But essentially it was the same because they had activated them all. But Turner didn't like them because they didn't have any experience. And the problem was all the line officers went to the surface combat commands or the carriers because they knew how to run operations at that level. And so all the reservists filled the supply corps slots, the JAG slots, the administrative slots. And so he had a lot of trouble not only working forward from, because he was based, his flagship mainly was based out of Noumea in New Caledonia. He had a lot of trouble working forward to the Solomons, but then he had to take the demand signal and translate it back and send it to San Diego to get the supplies that were needed. And so he had to work that nexus. He had a lot of trouble with the reserve component who just didn't have the experience. I'm a reservist myself, so I'm not castigating reservists here. I'm just saying that that actually may be an issue should we call up 50,000 Navy reservists next week. We might have a similar type of issue where you're going to have all these people coming in, me included at the moment, and having to figure out things on the fly, like happened there.
Yeah,
Anyway, I that's all we really had prepared to say. I know people have questions, and people who've read it can bring it up. So
Yeah, one of the things I was going to say is I felt a little disconcerted because I read those quotes about the wargaming and looking at how it was viewed in wargaming and it was not a line officer should know how to do it, so nobody really worried about it. I was like, nothing's really changed in the 80 years since then because we still sort of wish away logistics a lot of times in war games. It's like, well, we want to get right to the fighting, so we'll just assume we're already there and we'll assume that we have all the logistics we need in order to do that. So it's a little bit disconcerting to see. And then that view that you brought up of the reserves, I'm thinking back to reading books like Generation Kill, where there were scenes where it was like, oh well, Delta Company's here, full of reservists, and they're gonna muck everything up. So it's interesting to see how things haven't really changed necessarily in 80 years. You would have hoped that they would have gotten better. So I wanted to come back to one of the things you brought up about that institutionalized learning, and that as I was reading through the book, I kind of got this feeling that there were ebbs and flows in how good Navy logistics got. In between wars, it was sort of like every ship for themselves, basically. The ship's first lieutenant would come off and start doing contracts to get what the ship needed, and then they would go about their day and go on. But you would think after the Great White Fleet, making sure that we had coal everywhere in order to get those ships around the world, why wasn't it until World War II that we tried to capture these learning points, and not after one of the other wars before that?
So actually, a point I want to make about the Great White Fleet, and comes up in the contested logistics as well, right? Is the Great White Fleet almost got stranded in Australia because the British colliers didn't show up on time as they were contracted to do. And so I think my answer to that question is really that I don't think that this problem is related to really macro issues in the funding of the armed services. Is that there's much more attention on these issues in times of war because it's needed. And then you see this with the US Navy in the 20s and the 30s, is that there's a real ebb in thinking and preparation for this, which is because the budget is mercilessly slashed, both in response to the Washington Naval Conference, the Great Depression. And so the Navy is focused on, I think, much more basic operational issues at that point, and can't really think there's not the same space for the Navy to really think and institutionalize what's going on. And I think another point about World War II that today we often, I think, shortchange a little bit, right, is that before World War II, the American military establishment is something that's temporary, right? Is in the 19th century, right, is the standing army is a bad thing and a threat to democracy, so you just get all these volunteers in for national emergencies. The Navy's a little bit different, but if you look at World War I, it's also the same, just a temporary expansion. And then World War II has this great, in terms of scale, it's much larger than anything that happened before it. But then the geopolitical situation after World War II is such that America has a different, and sees itself as having a different role around the world. And so there are new requirements for the persistence of American military force, which I think is one of the reasons why there's much more of an institutional focus on capturing these lessons learned from World War II about operating forward. And so one of the, I guess if there's a hero in the book, or one of them would be Robert B. Carney, who ended up becoming CNO, but he was the first head of OP04, which is created after World War II. And that's the first time the Navy has a dedicated logistics directorate within the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. And those duties have been handled by a few people. And OpNav before World War II was relatively small compared to what it would become. And Tim, I think if you want to talk about Kelly Turner at all a little bit more, his time in OpNav is just, from today's perspective, you just had these very tiny staffs. And so then as the responsibilities after World War II increased, there's much more of an impetus to, I think, capture these lessons, to create institutions and channels to kind of, make these more complex evolutions possible.
Yeah, I mean, World War II is definitely a sort of a bifurcation event for what it means for post-war, right? And the creation of the Department of Defense and as a peacetime entity, because there is some pre-war innovation, obviously. I mean, you get the creation of the Chief of Naval Operations Staff in 1914. There's some lingering, like the idea of having permanent supply ships in commission that comes about from the Spanish-American War. They basically hire a bunch of cargo ships during the Spanish-American War and then keep a bunch of them in commission after the war. So it really is about 1900 that you start having supply ships as a component, auxiliaries as a component of the fleet. And that ebbs and flows over the next 30, 40 years. And it's really not until Vincent Trammell in 1934 that you get a sort of permanent creation of sort of new, modern auxiliaries that can begin to support operations, which is the only way we're able to do anything in 42, is because there's about 200 auxiliaries in the fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now that grows to 1,200 plus by the end of 43, and that makes a lot of things possible that were impossible in the summer of 42. But so there's that institutional piece that sort of, it goes in ebbs and flows, as you say, fits and starts, but it really doesn't become a permanent part of the bureaucracy until 47 with the National Security Act.
I think to tag along with that, exactly what you're saying, Tim, is that there are these institutions such as the General Board, which comes about. John Kuhn's written a really great book on the General Board, but that's an outgrowth of an ad hoc temporary advisory board put in place by Secretary of the Navy during the Spanish-American War to assist with operations. And so you got the General Board, and it ends up doing a lot of things. And then it's the same with CNO. And so I think, right, is that the Navy and I guess American political actors and institutions sort of see the need for expansion, but it's really the expansion comes as the result of it's a reaction to the world events more so than kind of preempting them.
So the first question we have from the chat is from Travis, and they ask, after publication of this history, have contemporary logistics leaders, both uniform and civilian, reached out and discussed their concerns over sustaining the force in the modern era based on the lessons in this monograph? Does anybody, I know we actually started the conversation about this book on a totally different topic, and then we kind of circled around and came back to this one. And I had talked about, was it commissioned because of what we were going through today? And there's a forward from the 3 rear admirals that kind of asked you to look into it. So, obviously a little bit was, but has anybody since its publication reached out to have any conversations with you about?
I would say in general, no. People in OpNav have reached out to Sam Cox, the director of the History Command, and mentioned that they like the book and that it's being talked about, but we haven't received a lot of follow-up.
Well, Travis did have a follow-up to that, and they asked, as you were going through and looking at it, do you think that the Japanese was advantaged due to the lack of a good logistics capability at the beginning of the war. They had a lot of success leading up to basically Midway, and then Guadalcanal, and things kind of reversed from there. It just took us a long time to get there. But do you think their initial success was due to our logistics capabilities at the time?
That's a pretty complex question, right? As everybody knows who looks at that time frame. I mean, there's the example from sort of the unspoken assumptions behind Warplane Orange, right? Which was, are we going to send the fleet across the Pacific to save the Philippines? Right? That was the intention in some of the versions of Warplane Orange, because there's 100,000 American troops in the Philippines, another couple 100,000 Filipinos who are our allies, right? But of course, right after Pearl Harbor, the next day, JCS essentially scratches that off the list of things that are possible, and so that was completely because of we didn't have the logistics capability for it, let alone, could we have put the aircraft carrier task forces together, et cetera. But it was scratched off without much thought on December 8th as an option, right? So then the Japanese expansion over the next 5 to 6 months, really, I think that's less of a logistics problem and more that they're inside our decision loop, right? By the time news travels and you come up with plans, because the Japanese have landed in northern Borneo, a week later they're in Java, or a month later they're in Java, and have essentially cut the ABCDA defense plan in two, right? And we're constantly behind the 8 ball there, and that's not all. I don't think that's a logistics problem. That's a force availability problem. That's a understanding what's going on. But I think it's mainly a force problem and the fact that the Japanese were advancing so quickly. And it's really the fact that if you look at the timelines, like when the Japanese get to Rabaul, for example, they are then delayed from continuing into the Solomons and going toward Namibia because they're still fighting they're fighting in the Philippines, and 2, they're fighting in the Dutch East Indies. And it takes a lot of effort to take out Malaysia, to take out the Dutch, even to run down all the Allied warships, defending the Dutch East Indies. They don't have a huge logistics tail either. And so they actually can't come back to the South Pacific until May. Whereas if they had gone to Guadalcanal and maybe made a lunge to Namibia back in March or even April, they might have gotten there before us. But we won the sort of logistics race to get to Namibia we got there before the Japanese did, essentially. So it's a complex answer to say that, yes, the Japanese kind of got as far as they did, partly because of our logistics inabilities, because we're spread out. We have to worry about the Atlantic and the Pacific, and we only have a couple hundred auxiliaries total, and they're inside our decision loop, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we also are able to get a supply line of lily pad bases, either in cooperation with the British and the Australians and the New Zealanders, or the Free French, and just sending CBs and Army people out there to hack an airfield on an island pretty quickly, certainly faster than the Japanese could do it. And we actually are able to get that supply line established to Australia through Namibia before the Japanese can get there.
Yeah, so it sounds like, less of a logistics problem on our part, but more that the Japanese had kind of gotten the ball rolling already for several years before that.
Right.
But they hit a culminating point, and we were able to, basically get on the tracks really past that culminating point and keep our, decision loop ahead of theirs from there on out. I think, magic as well probably helped in getting us
Hmm.
closer to staying ahead of their decision loop as well. That would be interesting. So Albert asks, in the spirit of the more things change and the more things stay the same, what lessons from the Navy's experience do you think are most applicable to the situation today? I think we had talked about in an email, you know, the changes in technology, the sizes of ships and how much things can be carried. You know, we have smaller forces now, but you could argue are probably more capable than some of the units we had back in World War II. So do you think there's still lessons, and you know, what lessons do you think would be most applicable to today that you guys saw while you were researching the book?
I think one lesson really is, you think of World War II for the United States starting in 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. As Tim mentioned earlier, is that you have Vincent Trammell in 1934. You have the National Industrial Recovery Act before that, which sort of stabilizes shipyards and funds some certain vessels. And so, right, that U.S. ramp up to World War II is actually starting early in the 30s. Like, that's the time frame for mobilization. And earlier, just the kind of mention of logistics versus force problem is that a lot of what the Navy is thinking about doing and wanting to do in the 30s is moderated and influenced by the domestic political situation. Is that FDR, in many cases, President Roosevelt, he has a clear idea of what his view of national strategy is and what the national interest is, but then he is working within a larger political environment that is concerned about the U.S. getting involved in foreign wars, a significant isolationist component. And so what you see the president doing over most of the 30s is using these authorities that are granted to him for industrial recovery or the Great Depression and sort of channeling some of that in cooperation with leadership in the Congress to really start getting the national defense establishment, such as it was, ready for war. So I think that's one lesson, is that there wasn't just some switch that flipped on December 8th. In terms of mobilization. And so there are some, and I talk about this, we talk about it in the book, there are some, I think, important steps and that are taken, but that can't really be realized until there's greater authority. For instance, the shipping administrators in the different naval districts that are supposed to route all of the naval shipping, is that the Navy can't the Navy doesn't have those billets because it needs to be authorized by Congress to have those billets. And this is the story, too, of Carney and that first evolution and projection of naval strength and logistics into Iceland. Right, that comes about as sort of the changing political situation, and then the president giving direct and explicit authorization. I need you on this problem, and I need you to figure out how to address this problem. And that's before Pearl Harbor. So I think that's, I think it's, even in World War II, it's not.
Yeah, we, so just to refresh. So the question is lessons learned for today.
Yeah, what lessons could we
Yeah.
take away from then that
So,
we could use
so
today?
I'm going to light off all my powder. So of the things that we talked about, and particularly related to the difficulties of Guadalcanal, right? There's a whole section in there about the problem of unloading at the beaches, right? Not having enough boats, not having enough barges, the cranes being loaded in the wrong parts of the hull, right? So you can't get access to them initially, having to like unload surf boats on the beach by hand at on 7 August, and then contingent events, etc. Right. So I do think, for example, today the Marines are probably better at getting stuff to the beach than they were back then. I'm just assuming that's the case. Given the types of equipment, LCATs and all that stuff, like you guys can get stuff to the beach, and you do practice that, right? Like, what is it, alligator?
Yeah,
right?
Bold Alligator,
Yeah.
the Navy LSC.
You do practice that. So I think that is probably not a problem you're going to have to worry about, right? Certainly as much. So that's probably, and certainly that's a lesson that the Marines have known for a long time. You look at all the amphibious and riverine operations in Vietnam that the Marines did, dozens and dozens of those, that all sinks into the institutional culture. And so you guys know how to do that. So that's a positive thing. Another thing is computer technology and communications technology, right? So one of the big problems that Turner had was just talking to Vandegrift, right? Or Compton, like the people at forward at Guadalcanal. Like, he had to write letters, and then they were sent up with the supply ships or by airplane, and to be hand delivered to the people on the ground, right? Because the radio didn't always work. You couldn't, it obviously, and it had to be encrypted by hand, right? So the encryption took a lot of time. And Turner says that basically you get a huge problem of knowing who needs what and where. And then he had a whole another problem of translating those requests. Like, they'd get a letter, just a list of supplies, but you can't just send a list of supplies to Navy supply people in San Diego and expect them to answer it. They're like, what about Form 27Z, right? And so Turner had to do a lot of work translating that and working that communication problem, where I think with encrypted and satellite comms today, that will probably be a lot easier. But that's obviously something to worry about. Like, you get people forward, how are you going to know what they need to know, right? And who needs what where, and how do you respond to that? The third piece, which I think, there's two more. Those are both positives, right? The two negatives are enemy action, right? So the U.S. Navy has not had a supply ship sunk in enemy action since 1945. There was a supply ship that was sunk by Viet Cong sappers in Vietnam, sunk in the harbor. Right? But we haven't had supply ships attacked at sea. There's no one really alive, and certainly not in serving, who knows what that's like, who knows how to deal with it. We obviously practice it, we think about it, exercises, but as Turner illustrated, right, they thought a lot about this in the 30s, and there were still a lot of problems with dealing with the fact that people were sinking your supply ships. And then how do you cope with that? And I think that's a problem that if we don't think about that, and you don't ask the people on the bleeding edge of things to think about, redundant supply. You can't just do just-in-time delivery. You need redundancy in your supply requests, because some of them aren't going to make it, right? So that's an issue that I think has to be thought about pretty deeply. And the very last thing, and which is another point that Carney talks about in the last chapter of the book, is there probably is not going to be an Iron Mountain, in the sense of having a giant depots full of supplies that you will get access to whenever you need them. Like, that was one of the responses. It's a complicated story, but basically by the end of the war, the Navy was just shipping like hundreds of tons of supplies to forward depots, and then letting the people in the forward areas sort out what they needed and just taking it from those supply dumps. We're not going to have that situation. I mean, look what's happening in Ukraine. We're not, at least not yet anyway, mobilizing industry on a broad scale to produce a giant mountain of everything that you might possibly need and then ship that forward. So again, how are you going to get, it goes back to that question of how are you going to know who needs what and where, and then how are you going to get that specific thing to them. So those are there. I've said that's kind of the 4 points I wanted to make.
And I think that feeds in really well to, you know, Albert had a question about, you know, fast-paced, small footprint deployments. And as you were bringing up those last 2 points, the things that came to mind immediately for me is EABO. So if I'm creating these small footprint, small units kind of spread across the first and second island chain, you know, how am I going to supply those Marines? Where are they going to get food, water, chow? You know, think about, hey, there's not going to be an Iron Mountain. So you know, it's interesting that you brought up those as 2 negative things that come out of those. And, you know, the first 2 points was like, yeah, okay, I get that. Communications are definitely much better. You know, the loading and unloading, we've definitely practiced that before. And so, you know, I took it in, but I didn't really connect it with anything. But those last 2 points, it was like I immediately connected it to something that we've been thinking about and considering today with EABO. So I feel like that answers Albert's question. So I have one question that I'm going to end with. So I'm going to hold that one for now because I think it's based on, you know, what's going on in a week from now, 81 years ago. So we'll get back to that one. But you know, as you're doing the research for this topic, you know, you had mentioned that a lot of the information you pulled from Admiral Kelly's papers because you had written a different book. Was there anything that you found while you were doing this research that's going to make you want to maybe do a deeper dive or look at different elements of logistics because of information you found doing the prep and the writing of this book?
Carney and Eccles.
Yeah, what really interested, really caught my attention is that, so Robert B. Carney, when he becomes the first OPO4, is that, as Tim pointed out with this Iron Mountain, is that Carney is very invested in capturing the lessons learned because he says multiple times, the only reason we won is that we could produce so much stuff, it didn't matter that we wasted about 80% of it at times. And so he says, we need to get better at this, and now I'm in a position to do it. And he ends up as OPO4 because there's a conscious decision made to put an operator as the first head of logistics rather than a supply person. That's Carney was selected for his broad experience in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so Carney starts, you know, he puts his money where his mouth is that he sends $900,000 in 1940s money to Naval War College to get a logistics program going. And the first person in charge of that is Henry Eccles, who was captain in the Navy during World War II, but was in charge of advanced base operations and theater. And so that's what's very fascinating to me is this interplay between the people who had operated in World War II and then how they're taking that knowledge and then putting it into the professional military education in the Navy after World War II. And what also really fascinated me about this is how really the predecessor of Naval History and Heritage Command fit into all of this. Because many of the questions that were coming up is that the books that answered them were done by NHHC organization in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Like Duncan Ballantyne's book on naval logistics in the Second World War was sponsored by the Naval History Division. The head of Naval History, Ernest Eller, was really invested in that project. James Richardson's On the Treadmill to Pearl Harbor, which talks about the Navy's preparation and run up to World War II, was done by the predecessor, and so on.
Dyer.
Yeah, the reason we have Kelly Turner's paper at all is because George Dyer was hired to write a history. Well, I mean, it's a matter of some debate what he was hired to do, whether a history of the amphibious force in the Pacific or a biography of Kelly Turner. And he ended up writing something that was a little bit of both. But part of that effort was that he went to the Navy Records Center and hoovered up all of these papers and then used them to write the book, and then they ended up at NHHC. But what I saw, and it's sort of obvious, is that Ernest Eller, who is the most influential of the directors of predecessor organization here, is that he'd been education officer in Pac Fleet during World War II. And so he ended up at naval history. He said, we need to capture these lessons learned. I want what the senior leaders learned, what they thought was important, and we need to document that and get that back out. And that's really what I think is really my next steps in terms of research, is really Carney, Eccles, Eller, this broader naval learning after World War II, and how did the Navy conceive of the lessons learned, and then how did it kind of codify those. And
as part of that, there's a line in one of Turner's letters where he says, 80% of my time was given to logistics during the first 4 months of Watchtower, because we're living from one logistics crisis to another. Right? And so then Carney sets up this logistics organization after the war. It's again being taught at the War College. Carney there's lectures that he gives to supply officers about the importance of logistics and the fact that there's not going to be an Iron Mountain. And so one of my thoughts for follow-on research is, how does that then play out for Korea and Vietnam, right? Like, you don't really hear about logistics crises in either one of those cases. If so, why? Yeah. Right? Like, were there problems? And if there were, what were they? And if there weren't, why weren't there? Like, what is the missing? Why is it different? And so that's an area that I'm not sure if we have. I don't think we have the access to the records to do Korea, but we might be able to do something with Vietnam, but we'll see.
So one of the questions we did get kind of right at the end, so you brought up the comment about, hey, we were able to kind of turn on the industrial machine. Yeah, we turned it on in the 30s, but we were really able to ramp up to the point where, we could have, what's the famous quote, for every Tiger that they built, we were able to build 7 Shermans.
Right.
Do you think the complexity of the equipment and gear that we're producing today, do you think we'd be able to do that kind of same turn on if we had to do it, or do you think that is another negative? Even though we're able to load faster, we've got better communications, but does the complexity of systems make it harder?
I think the short answer to that is definitely it makes it harder. And just by way of example, is people are part of these systems too, and broadly speaking, the personnel supply is part of logistics. But if you compare how long it takes somebody in training to learn how to fly a Wildcat versus how long it takes to train somebody to fly a V-22, like, that's a protracted timeline apart from just the machinery and the industrial side of it.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of brought up in Ghost Fleet,
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
where it's one of the, or another analogy is the Iran-Iraq War, right, in the 80s, where of course they didn't have an industrial base on either side, but still they ran out of their advanced equipment pretty quickly, and then it lowered the technology level of that war toward in the middle and end years of that fight. And there might be, we have lots of ways to short circuit some of that complexity. We can stamp out microchips pretty quickly, kind of thing. And there is a huge manufacturing base for IT equipment and all that stuff. So, needs must, maybe, right? Maybe we come up with something, but I think we're still illustrating, like with Ukraine, right? The West is having a lot of trouble supplying high-tech equipment in quantity. Now, granted, it's not us, it's a step removed, so it's not existential for us. And if it was existential, maybe minds and commitment and political will would change. But I think that's a great question, and I think. But if I was going to pick one answer, it would be no. We're not going to have an iron mountain of stuff. We're going to be our waging a future war, if Ukraine is anything to go by, is we're going to be like the Axis, where we're going to have very high skilled people and equipment and technology, but it's not going to be replaceable at scale. And there's a whole. I gave 2 talks in front of Congress for Midway celebration days. I got like 8 minutes to give a little speech on the importance of the Battle of Midway. And in both cases, I mentioned the problem of shipbuilding and replacing equipment, and that the U.S. Navy was a lot more like the IJM in 1942. We're a lot like that today, in that highly skilled, most experienced, but fragile in the sense that difficult to replace a carrier nowadays. Whereas then in the 40s, you could build one pretty quickly.
So we're quickly closing in on our hour. So I'll bring out the question related to Guadalcanal, and then we'll leave it up to some closing comments from each of you. But famously, the Navy left the Marines ashore, and there's been some animosity between the two, especially throughout the war. I think some of that animosity has gone more towards gentle ribbing in these days. But is it a fair assessment? And based on my reading, it doesn't seem like it was a fair assessment. It's sort of, this is how I view things. Now, knowing that we've got Navy history over here, so that's one side of it. We got Marine on this side.
Right.
We probably have the sides that we want to pick. But do you think the animosity was fair based on what was going on for Turner and what was going on for Vandegrift?
I don't want to steal Tim's thunder on this, but George Dyer talks about this, and amphibians came to conquer, and there's an extended discussion of it. And Dyer talked to Turner, but the general point Turner makes is that Tim mentioned it with how much time Turner was spending on logistics, is that Turner in his person needed to handle a lot of this. And he says, I couldn't do that afloat at Guadalcanal. And I had to be where I could address it and handle those concerns. And so for the people that were left behind, it seemed like he disappeared. But what Dyer and Turner said is he went to where he could be the most effective in ensuring that the supply would get forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a tricky question. I'm sort of agnostic on it, frankly. I think you had the combination of so the carriers leave first, right? And that is a concern because the fighter squadrons take a lot of have a lot of operational losses. So they're worried that they won't have enough fighter cover if the Japanese show up with their fleet carriers, right, that they could lose. So that essentially the carriers leave in order to replenish their VF squadrons. Right? That's the rationale. That's often lost in the discussion, but that's the reason. The surface force is then crushed at the Battle of Savo Island, right? So there's a series of things that have to happen for this to be a dispute, right? So you can't really say the surface force ran away when they lose 1,200 sailors in a night battle with the Japanese. The transports. So they have to leave, and there's a lot of those ships that survive are also damaged, so they got to go get resupplied and repaired. And Turner's supply ships actually stick around all of the next day, but then they don't have any air cover, and they don't have any surface cover. The airfield isn't really working yet, right? It's only been one day. There's no aviation people on the ground. You can't really fly air cover. And Espiritu Santo is 600 miles away. So who was going to stay anyway is kind of the question. Now, granted, you know, calculated risk might say the carriers could have stuck around longer, but I don't know. There's certainly grounds to be annoyed at it from the Marine side. I'll give you that.
So we're definitely at the end of our time, but I just want to leave a couple minutes for each of you if you had any closing comments you wanted to make before we finish and close out the episode here.
I think really just what I'd leave everyone with is actually a quote from a Royal Navy captain about early 20th century course that officers had, is that the point of it in history was to bring officers face to face with an appreciation of the vastness of the problems that war would create. And I think that's my thinking behind a lot of this booklet. It's not that officers and personnel today don't have an idea about the complexity of it, but just to sort of walk through how very smart people in World War II confronted this problem and conceived of it, and in many ways couldn't really grasp it at the time that it was going on, and kind of open ways of thinking about what's happening today. Just sort of give a different perspective and really underscore the point of how complex all of this is, and almost in a sense of kind of humility that things are going to go in unexpected directions, and even if people think that they're incredibly prepared, and often are, they may not be prepared enough for the situation that confronts them, and then how people have made decisions and acted in the past to confront analogs.
Yeah, and I would go back to the point I made about that the enemy gets a vote, right? That when we used to, when we would do convoy prep in Iraq, right? It was always think ahead of time about what happens if you end up on an X, right? You got to get off it and do your various responses, right? We need to keep thinking about even just the thinking of the enemy's going to sink our stuff. They're going to disrupt our processes in a way that we have not had happen in a very long time. So how do we respond to that, right? Even just the practice of thinking that has got to be able to help if and when that ever actually happens. And so that would seem to me like a good lesson going forward, is think about it's going to be a really difficult process, right? And then the enemy's going to have a vote, so it's going to become 4 times harder than your paper process. And so think about how that gets managed. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. I know coming down from DC, it's a bit of a drive, so thank you for your time and your insight today. And thank you to those in the chat who joined us. That's all we have for today, so go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.